In the quiet community of Killeen, Texas, Thanksgiving marked the beginning of a hour killing spree that would leave 4 people dead. What started as workplace revenge quickly spiraled into calculated murder as Richard Tabler, armed with a hit list and a 9mm handgun, targeted employees of a local nightclub. Most chilling were his taunting calls to police, promising more victims unless his demands were met. The story of Richard Tabler reveals how a troubled childhood can evolve into deadly violence, and how justice sometimes takes decades to unfold. Welcome to X by X Confidential, your deep dive into the most chilling cases from America's criminal history. I'm your host, and I want to personally thank each and every one of you for watching our videos. Before we continue with today's disturbing case, make sure you smash the like button and don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell to get notifications when we release our next video. Your support means everything to us, and it helps us bring these important stories to light. Now, let's return to the shocking case of Richard Lee Tabler and the 4 lives he ended in just 48 hours. Troubled beginnings. The sprawling farmlands of Tulare County, California seem peaceful from a distance. But on February 5, 1979, a child was born into a home that was anything but. At the county records office, the birth certificate of Richard Lee Tabler, a name that would one day be linked to one of the most shocking murder sprees in Texas history. His early life was rough, no doubt about it, says Dr. Ellen Morgan, a child psychologist who reviewed Tabler's case files. What we see in these records paints a picture of profound neglect and instability. Court documents tell the story of a troubled marriage between Tabler's parents, Robert and Lorraine. His mother's pregnancy was reportedly unplanned, and his father had initially pressed for an abortion. When Robert wasn't working long hours, traveling, or drinking excessively, he paid little attention to his son. The boy didn't stand a chance with parents like that, whispers a former neighbor who asked to remain anonymous. The screaming matches between those two. It was horrible to hear. By the time Richard was 10 years old, his mother left for good. He bounced between states, living sometimes with his mother in Florida and Nevada, but mostly with his father in California. School records show he repeated the 3rd grade and struggled to pay attention in class. He was a lonely kid with only one friend, notes his elementary school teacher, Miss Winters. I tried to reach him, but there was something distant about him. At age 12, Richard was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. His mother and sister would later describe him as good-natured, despite a quick temper that would flare without warning. Looking back at these early years, says forensic psychiatrist Dr. James Hernandez, we can see the classic warning signs of someone whose emotional development was severely compromised. The neglect, the instability, the lack of positive role models. These factors don't excuse what happened later, but they help us understand how a person can become disconnected from normal human empathy. Little did anyone know that this troubled child would grow into a man whose name would be associated with 4 brutal murders in Killeen, Texas, leaving a community terrified and investigators racing to connect the dots before more lives were lost. Section 2. A pattern of trouble. As Richard Tabler grew into adulthood, his troubled childhood evolved into a pattern of criminal behavior that kept escalating. Outside the California State Prison, where Tabler served 3 years for 2nd-degree burglary, escape, and assault on a police officer. He wasn't just your typical offender, says former corrections officer Marcus Jenkins. There was something about him that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. He had this way of looking at you, like he was trying to memorize everything about you for later. The prison records show multiple incidents of Tabler threatening both law enforcement officers and fellow inmates. His file contains numerous disciplinary reports documenting his volatile behavior. In 2003, we picked him up on a parole violation, recalls Officer Trent Wilson. What happened next still gives me chills. This guy managed to escape from the patrol car while handcuffed. When we caught him again, he went ballistic, kicking out the windows of the 2nd patrol car. But it was what happened after his recapture that truly alarmed authorities. Tabler directly threatened his parole officer, stating he would take care of him and his family. Those weren't empty words, the parole officer later testified. There was a coldness in his eyes that told me he meant every word. I took those threats seriously enough to warn my family and increase security at our home. By 2004, Tabler had made his way to Killeen, Texas, the city adjacent to Fort Hood military base. He found work at a local nightclub managed by 25-year-old Mohamed-Amine Ramouni. What started as a job opportunity would soon set the stage for a brutal series of killings that would shock the community to its core. Section 3. The Thanksgiving Murders. Thanksgiving Day, 2004. While most families in Killeen, Texas were gathering around dinner tables, a deadly plan was being set into motion. The parking lot of a strip club called Teasers, where employees were unaware that one of their former colleagues had marked the establishment for bloodshed. Richard had worked here briefly, explains Detective Sarah Gonzalez, pointing to the back door of the club. He and the manager, Rahmouni, had some kind of falling out that cost Tabler his job. According to witnesses, Rahmouni had allegedly threatened Tabler, saying he could wipe out Tabler's family for just $10. Whether the threat was real or perceived, Tabler had been planning his revenge for days. On November 18th, he purchased a camcorder, a pickup truck, and a 9mm handgun. We found the receipts, Detective Gonzalez continues. Every purchase was deliberate, part of a calculated plan. Thanksgiving night, Tabler contacted Rahmouni with an offer to sell stereo equipment for $1,500. They arranged to meet at the parking lot of a local business. What Rahmouni didn't know was that he was walking into an ambush, says Police Chief Robert Garrison. He arrived with his friend, Haitham Frank Zayed, who was driving. Based on the crime scene evidence, it appears they had no idea what was about to happen. When the two men pulled into the lot, Tabler was waiting in a pickup truck. He wasn't alone. A young Fort Hood soldier, Timothy Doane Payne, was with him. What happened next was captured on the camcorder Tabler had purchased days earlier. The video, which was later destroyed, reportedly showed Tabler approaching their car and opening fire, explains forensic analyst Dr. Maya Peterson. He shot Zayed first, then Rahmouni. The blood spatter analysis indicates that after the initial shots, Tabler dragged both victims from the vehicle. Rahmouni was still alive when pulled from the car. Tabler delivered a second shot at point-blank range, ending his life. After the murders, Tabler took a wallet and a black bag from the victim's car, says Detective Gonzalez. But what he did next shows just how bold, or perhaps deranged, he had become. That night, the Bell County Sheriff's Office received a disturbing call. The caller claimed responsibility for the double murder and made a chilling promise: there would be more killings to come. We didn't know who the caller was at that point, says Sheriff's Deputy James Morales. But we took the threat seriously. 2 men were dead, and the caller was essentially taunting us, telling us more bodies would drop. No one could have predicted how quickly that threat would become reality. Section 4. The Second Attack. 2 days after the Thanksgiving murders, as Killeen police were working around the clock to solve the double homicide, another deadly scene was unfolding at Stillhouse Hollow Lake. On November 28, 2004, 2 young lives were violently cut short. According to what we later learned, Tabler had compiled a hit list of 11 employees from Rahmouni's club, says Detective Gonzalez, looking out over the water. On that list were 2 teenage dancers, 16-year-old Amanda Benefield and 18-year-old Tiffany Lorraine Dotson. Both girls worked at Teasers. Both were vulnerable, young, and trusting. Tabler allegedly lured them out with promises of drugs. We believe he convinced them to come to this isolated location, explains Sheriff's Deputy Morales, pointing to a wooded area near the lake. Once they were here, away from witnesses, he turned his gun on them and fired multiple times. The cold-blooded execution left both teenagers dead at the scene, their bodies hidden among the brush near the water's edge. Tabler later claimed he believed the girls had somehow implicated him in the Thanksgiving killings, says Police Chief Garrison. There's no evidence to support that. More likely, these were senseless murders committed by someone who had developed a taste for killing. But the killer wasn't done. Once again, the sheriff's office received a taunting phone call. The caller, who we still hadn't identified, was practically gloating, recalls Sheriff's Deputy Rodriguez. He threatened to kill more club employees if we didn't shut down Teasers. He even threatened law enforcement directly, saying he'd come after us if we didn't close the club. For the tight-knit community of Killeen, fear was spreading. 2 separate double homicides in 3 days, with the killer still at large and threatening more violence. People were terrified, remembers local resident Marion Thompson. Parents were keeping their kids home from school. Nobody knew who might be next. The bodies of the teenage victims wouldn't be discovered until an employee of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers stumbled upon them during a routine inspection of the area. While Tiffany Dotson was quickly identified, Amanda Benefield's identity remained a mystery for days. She was a runaway from Louisiana, explains Detective Gonzalez. It wasn't until December 4th that we were able to confirm who she was. By then, We were racing against time to catch the killer before he struck again. Section 5. The investigation unfolds. As investigators raced to connect the dots between the 4 murders, a seemingly unrelated arrest would break the case wide open. At the Bell County Jail, where on November 28, 2004, the same day Benefield and Dotson were murdered, Richard Tabler was brought in on felony theft charges. It was pure coincidence, explained Sheriff Williams. Tabler was arrested for a theft completely unrelated to the murders, but once we had him in custody, detectives working the homicide cases noticed some suspicious connections. Police had been working on the theory that the Teasers nightclub was the common thread linking all 4 victims. When they learned that Tabler had previously worked there and had been fired after a dispute with Ramouni, he immediately became a person of interest. During questioning about the theft charge, our detectives carefully introduced questions about the murders, says Detective Gonzalez. What happened next was unexpected. Tabler broke down and confessed to all 4 killings. The confession included details that only the killer would know. Tabler also named Timothy Payne, an 18-year-old Fort Hood soldier, as his accomplice in the Thanksgiving murders. Based on Tabler's statement, we immediately brought Payne in for questioning, explains Police Chief Garrison. The evidence against both of them was mounting quickly. The case took another turn when forensic technicians examined the 9mm handgun found in Tabler's possession at the time of his arrest. Ballistics tests confirmed it was the same weapon used in all 4 murders. That gun was the smoking gun, literally, says ballistics expert Thomas Reed. The striations on the bullets recovered from all 4 victims matched Tabler's weapon perfectly. There was no doubt we had our killer. On November 30, 2004, both Tabler and Payne were formally charged with capital murder for the deaths of Ramouni and Zayed. 10 days later, on December 10th, Tabler was additionally charged with the capital murders of Benefield and Dotson. Despite his initial confession, Tabler later recanted, notes prosecutor Linda Martinez. He claimed he never confessed and denied any involvement in the homicides, but the evidence told a different story. The case was building, and for the families of the victims, the path to justice had begun. But no one could have predicted the bizarre twists that would follow as Tabler's case wound its way through the legal system. Section 6. Justice System at Work. The Bell County Courthouse stands as a monument to justice in the heart of Belton, Texas. On February 17, 2005, a grand jury handed down indictments against both Richard Tabler and Timothy Payne for the Thanksgiving double murders. The indictment process was straightforward given the evidence, explains District Attorney James Sullivan. What wasn't straightforward was what happened next. Both defendants initially pleaded not guilty to all charges. Tabler's defense team filed a motion to remove the death penalty from consideration, citing diminished responsibility due to his troubled background and mental health issues. That motion was rejected by Judge Martha Trudeau in January 2007, says court reporter Melissa Chen. The prosecution had already announced in May 2005 that they would seek the death penalty for Tabler. The message was clear: these crimes were heinous enough to warrant the ultimate punishment. Tabler's trial was initially set for late 2006, but was delayed until March 2007. Jury selection began on February 12th, with the trial officially starting on March 19, 2007. I was in the courtroom for those opening arguments, remembers local journalist David Pearson. The prosecution laid out a methodical case connecting Tabler to each murder with physical evidence, ballistics, and witness testimony. His own confession, though later recanted, was particularly damning. After just 2 days of deliberation on March 21, 2007, the jury found Richard Tabler guilty of murdering Ramouni and Zayed. The penalty phase began on March 26. During sentencing, we heard compelling testimony about Tabler's troubled childhood and history of mental health issues, says Juror 8, who asked to remain anonymous. But we also heard about the calculated nature of the crimes, the taunting phone calls, and the apparent lack of remorse. It was difficult but necessary to weigh all these factors. On April 2, 2007, the jury returned with their verdict: death by lethal injection for each count of capital murder. Interestingly, the charges for the murders of Benefield and Dotson remained pending, with no trial date ever set for those killings. Timothy Payne faced his own trial in November 2007. He was convicted of capital murder on both counts but received life imprisonment rather than the death penalty. He would become eligible for parole in 2044, after serving a minimum of 40 years. The different outcomes for Tabler and Payne reflected their different roles in the crimes, explains legal analyst Patricia Wilson. While both were culpable, the evidence suggested Tabler was the primary actor and the one who pulled the trigger in all 4 murders. Section 7, Aftermath and Death Row. The Alan B. Polunsky Unit in Livingston, Texas, houses some of the state's most dangerous criminals. This maximum security facility where Richard Tabler has spent years on death row, his case taking bizarre turns that few could have anticipated. Tabler's time on death row has been anything but quiet, explains prison administrator James Morton. In October 2008, he attempted suicide and was temporarily transferred to the Jester 4 unit for psychiatric treatment. But it was what happened earlier that month that caused a statewide scandal. Tabler had somehow obtained a smuggled cell phone and used it to make threatening calls to State Senator John Whitmire. "He knew my daughter's names and where I lived," Senator Whitmire recalled in a press statement. "He made it clear he could reach beyond prison walls if he wanted to." Investigators discovered that Tabler had shared the phone with 9 other death row inmates, and they had collectively made nearly 3,000 calls over 30 days. The revelation led to a complete lockdown of the Texas prison system. We later learned that Tabler's mother had smuggled the phone into the prison during visits, says Texas Department of Criminal Justice spokesperson Maria Gutierrez. She was arrested at an airport when she came to visit her son and faced charges for bringing prohibited items into the prison. In May 2009, Tabler received an additional 10-year sentence for the phone smuggling and threats. But his threatening behavior didn't stop there. Over the years, he continued to send letters threatening Senator Whitmire, even persuading a prison chaplain to smuggle some out. He even created a weblog to publish more threats. His appeals process has been complicated by his own contradictory actions, explains appellate attorney Roland Washington. Multiple times, Tabler has asked to waive his appeals and be executed, only to change his mind and continue fighting his sentence. After exhausting his state appeals in 2009, Tabler turned to the federal courts. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals rejected his appeal in 2014, and subsequent appeals were similarly unsuccessful. In October 2023, another appeal was dismissed, and in October 2024, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear his final appeal, confirming his death sentence. Richard Tabler is currently scheduled for execution by lethal injection on February 13, 2025. States Prison Warden Thomas Reynolds. After 20 years, the families of his victims may finally see justice served. As I look at the high walls and razor wire of the prison, I'm reminded of the 4 lives cut short in those 3 days of violence in November 2004. Mohamed-Amine Rahmouni, Haitham Frank Zayed, Tiffany Lorraine Dotson, and Amanda Benefield. Their names forever linked to a killing spree that shocked Texas and revealed how a troubled past can evolve into deadly violence. In cases like these, concludes Detective Gonzalez, who is since retired, there are no winners. 4 people lost their lives. Countless family members and friends continue to suffer. And a man who might have taken a different path will pay the ultimate price for his choices. The Richard Lee Tabler case stands as a stark reminder of how quickly violence can escalate, and the long, winding road to justice that follows in its wake. I want to thank you all for watching this episode of X by X Confidential. The Richard Tabler case reminds us how quickly violence can escalate, and the devastating impact it has on families and communities. What do you think drove Tabler to commit these horrific crimes? Was it truly revenge, mental illness, or something else entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to smash that like button if you found this case as fascinating as I did. And please subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Your support means the world to us, and we couldn't continue bringing these stories to light without you. Until next time, stay safe and remember that justice, though sometimes slow, eventually comes for everyone.